Hello, everyone, and we're going to take a look at a new type of programming structure today. We're going to be looking at variables and functions. Now, a variable allows us to store a value and then call that value later. Now, there are two things I want to show on this code example before we jump into that. One is the start command the start comment and the end comment. Now, the start comment is showing me where I'm starting my program. That's going to become important as we start utilizing functions because we need to know which of these actually starts our program, and it always will be main. So we want to make sure we use this start. That's going to help us delineate where things are happening. And the end comment, and both of these will encapsulate all of our running code. Now let's see what this code does. We have a while loop that is always true. It is an infinite loop. 1 is always 1. And motor 1 spin is going to spin forward at 100 RPM. Wait a second and then stop. Well, we have a little problem as far as how this code could function. Now, it's going to work for us. It is going to spin that motor at 100 RPM. But what if I wanted to spin at 50? Well, I'll have to go down into the code, and I'm going to have to change this number to 50. And I have to do that every time. Now, this is a very simple code. We start at line 28. We go down to line 42. It's pretty short. And we have a comment in there, some spaces. So there's not a lot here, but as code gets longer and more complex, we want to stay away from typing numbers directly into the code. This is what we call hard coding, which means we chose a number and we typed that number directly in. Instead, we want to use variables. So I'm going to come here under int main, and I'm going to add a new line. I'm going to tab over, and I want to call this section variables. And so I've now delineated this as my variable section, and I'm going to start setting these up. I'm going to type in int. Int means integer, so this will be some sort of number. I'm going to type speed as the name equals, which assigns a value 100 and a semicolon. So as we look at this, let's break down what each of these are. Now, int tells me the type of variable. It is an integer value, which is a whole number. Speed is the name of the variable. Whenever I come up with a variable name, I want it to be meaningful. So it's easy to understand what this is doing. Now, we do see we have an error here. It's an unused variable. We're going to change that in a moment. Now I have an equals and a 100. Well, 100 is the value that I want to store inside of speed. But I have to use the equal sign to do that. If I were to read this code, I would say speed gets 100 because equals assigns. As we look down at line 35, we'll see that double equals is for equivalency. So I put a double equals to say this is equal to that. But a single equal sign is assigning the value. We are saying speed will be 100. Now I'm going to come down here to line 37, and where I have 100, I will type speed. And now instead of having to have a number value here, this variable will replace that. So I can now change speed here one time, and now the value here will be whatever speed was assigned. So every time the word speed is used, it will assign that value. So if I have this 50 times in my code, I never change it except for here. This is good form. Whenever we are programming, we do not want to use numbers directly in the code. Now, I can change a few things in my code to fix that problem. I see that I'm waiting 1 second, so I'm going to change this. Instead of just waiting a second, I'm going to say int pause gets 1 and my semicolon. So down here, instead of 1, I'm going to type in pause. So now I can change that delay from 1 second to 2 seconds or whatever I want to from here. Now that's going to be a very useful feature, especially the more I want to pause this or however I want to change it. I also see I have while 1 equals 1. I'm going to simplify this to just true. Well, while true is always true, it's going to execute my loop. So I once again have an infinite loop, and it's going to execute my code based on my variable values. So this is a very useful feature you want to consistently use in your code from now on, is assigning variables and giving them meaningful names. And over to the side, I would want to add in a comment explaining what this variable is used for. So I could say this would be controlling the speed of the motor. So this speed variable controls the motor speeds, and I can assign that however I want. Now, this is the first piece we're going to look at, the first type of structure. The second we want to look at is a function. So a function is like code that runs outside of our main function. And it can really simplify the pieces of main. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to put a couple lines in, and we're going to create a code. Well, I'm going to start by naming this void motor underscore start. And then I'm going to come and add in my brackets. Now, what does each part of this do? Void. Void is something that will tell us what this function is going to give in response to being called, and we'll look at how to call it in a moment. Well, in this case, we will not have anything returned from our function, so we call it void. It's just going to execute some code in here. Motor start, well, I'm going to write a little code that will start the motor and shut down the motor. And then I have these. We only put past variables in here, which we really don't have to do anything, so that's okay. And I want to take this code here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it into our motor code. Now we already see we have some issues. Speed and pause no longer work. Well, why don't they work anymore? It's because these are local variables. That means they are only in the function main. So I'm going to take these as well, and I'm going to copy them, and we're going to put them in our main function. We'll make sure all of our tabs are aligned. And oh, we need to go ahead and move this down. So we now have a program, a little function that will start the motor, pause for a second, and stop. So now instead of having all this code, I'm just going to type in motor underscore start, and it's going to execute all of this code at this function call. This is what we refer to as calling the function. The function's name is motor start. So when I type this as this command line, it's going to execute all of this code at this point. So now instead of having to retype this every time I would want to start the motor, pause, and stop the motor, I can just call the function and it'll do it for me. Let's make this a little more interesting. Let's say I don't want my function to run forever, so I only want this to run 5 times. Well, I'm going to create a new variable section. And in that variable section, I am going to create a new variable. It's going to be an integer. I'm going to call it count, and I'm going to give it the value of 0. Now, if you look online for different types of counters, like the one we're going to create, they may use X or I. We don't use that in formal programming because count is a descriptive variable name. So I should never see a one-letter iterator assigned in your function right now. There are going to be times we may use one as a standard, but that is not what we'll be looking at the moment. So we're going to use a count to count how many times our loop is executed. Right now, it's at 0. So I'm going to say while true. Well, instead of while true, we're going to say while count is less than 5. So let's say motor starts. Well, the motor will start, pause for 1 second, and then stop. Now I'm going to say count gets count plus 1. So count equals 0. But when we get down here, I'm going to say, well, now assign the value of count plus 1. Well, count is 0 plus 1. So it's going to add 1 and then give it a new value. So it's going to test count of 1 is less than 5. Well, it's still less than 5. So it's going to come back and it's going to repeat this process until count equals 5. So now I've been able to create a variable that counts for me to make sure this does not execute more times than I want it to.